The latest on the Big 12 and why all this leaked. Coming up, you're Locked On UConn.
You are Locked On UConn, your daily podcast on the UConn Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On UConn your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Before we dive into today's show, just wanted to take a quick moment to ask you for a favor. If you're enjoying the content here, please take a quick second to subscribe to the show. Follow the audio versions wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps the show grow, and I can't tell you how much we appreciate that support. Thank you so much for being a part of this community. Today's episode is brought to you by 5 Hour Energy. It fixes tired fast. With zero sugar in a convenient portable size, it's the perfect pick-me-up for getting stuff done. Go to 5hourenergy.com. Use the promo code LOCKEDONCFB to receive 20% off your first order. This offer is only valid till September 30th, and one order cannot be used with other promotions. So go to 5hourenergy.com today. We bring in senior writer from The Athletic covering college football and basketball, Justin Williams. Let's get him in here. Justin, first question. First off, thanks for coming. Wanted to ask you, we've talked about this news dropping last Tuesday. Your story dropped Friday with Andrew Marchand. If this wasn't a done deal, the votes, an extension of an invite to UConn, why is it so out in the open?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that it wouldn't get out in the open is a little far-fetched because, you know, as I'm sure you've talked about, as we reported, UConn AD David Benedict went down to the Big 12 meetings in Dallas. I think we're now about 2 weeks out from that. So you're talking about, you know, some UConn officials going to an in-person meeting with 16 Big 12 schools. Like, that's, you know, it's going to be tough in kind of today's environment to keep that quiet. I do think, you know, this is not something that Brett Yormark has given up on, you know, kind of pursuing UConn, and this has been in the news for over a year now.
Sure.
I do think that there was some sense that, you know, it's always a little bit better to kind of work behind the scenes and in silence, especially when you're talking with presidents and, you know, not wanting public opinion to impact things. So I think there was definitely a hope, probably on both sides, the UConn and the Big 12, that this wouldn't kind of get out there at least until maybe some decisions were made. But I think that's, like I said, is a little far-fetched to believe that was going to happen over the course of multiple weeks.
Okay, so there's no truth to the rumor, because I received some reports, they turned out to be false, that these votes were imminent, that they had 12 votes. You know, where is that at now? Is there a vote that's on the horizon? The last we've heard from a source that brought me this story almost 2-3 weeks ago, it's gone from 12 votes to potentially 10. So I'm trying to get more answers from folks like you who are in the weeds with this.
Yeah, I think obviously that the Big 12 would need 12 of 16 votes, and these are made by presidents. Obviously, ADs and other people within the schools are going to have a lot of input and impact on that. The votes have not been there previously. If they were, UConn would be
Sure.
a member of the Big 12 or a pending member of the Big 12. I haven't gotten the sense yet that there's been enough of a shift in some of those decisions that the Big 12 does have the 12 votes necessarily to bring in UConn. I think if that were the case, again, after they had this meeting earlier this week on Monday, we probably would have seen a vote. I know in the past, more so with Gonzaga, it's been a situation of, you know, almost kind of whipping the votes and doing a straw poll and seeing like, all right, you know, is there enough support out there for this? If not, we're not going to bring it to a vote. I think that's probably a similar case here with UConn. My guess is if it does eventually go to an actual, you know, conference vote, that means that they probably feel pretty confident that they have the votes to get to yes, 12 of the 16. Until then, I think it's just a lot of information and a lot of conversation. Some of those are kind of those public ones, like the meeting Monday, which was run by Endeavor, which is like a branding consultant firm that the Big 12 has used for years. And then I think a lot of it, you know, it's like politics, right? A lot of this is happening phone calls between individual people and kind of, you know, behind closed doors and seeing where somebody's at and what does it take to get you to yes. Or if you're on the other side, you know, people calling around and saying, all right, here, this school's against it. You know, how are you guys feeling? So I think UConn, you would know this better than me. I think UConn seems interested in this move. It's obvious Brett Yormark, you know, at the Big 12 level is interested in pursuing UConn. But best as I can tell, there's not enough internal support among Big 12 membership yet to vote yes. And, I do think it's one of those things where, okay, sometime in the next couple of weeks, they'd like to get to a point where it's like, are we going to have this vote or not? But again, this is a story that last summer, Brett Yormark is saying, all right, these talks are over. They're done. We're not pursuing these schools anymore. And obviously that's come back around. So I think at least unless, something kind of drastic happens, this is a situation where Brett Yormark is going to be interested in probably pursuing it for as long as he can.
For sure. And you brought up a good point about how, because I was going to ask you that question. Can you share any insights about what specifically changed? What reignited these discussions? Did they start up again? And at what point has this constantly been going on behind the scenes until a story broke? Or is it just kind of, Brett Yormark's kind of really wants that tie to the Northeast? What is it about UConn that he wants to bring? And even if it's pushing out football to 2031.
Yeah, I do think it's something that Brett Yormark is interested in. And I think whether it's, a case of it kind of going quiet or dormant for a little bit, we know now Brett Yormark is a deal maker, right? That's always something he's going to be interested in. So I think part of it is probably, whether it's him and the Big 12 working with UConn or just, working with whoever to kind of figure out maybe more specifics of how this deal might play out. And this feels like this time we've kind of gotten the most specifics in terms of all the sports except football would join as soon as they could exit the Big 12. Football wouldn't join until the next, media rights deal in 2031. That feels like kind of progress maybe that we hadn't necessarily heard before on this front. And so I think part of it is just kind of continuing to work towards maybe more concrete examples of what this deal would look like, how it would work. The other big thing that's been talked about is something I've heard multiple times is this would be a budget neutral deal for the rest of the Big 12, which is something I think that was with the four corner schools coming in last year, there was a little bit of dilution of and the previous four schools in terms of annual distribution of conference funds and things like that. I think with the new 16-team conference, there wanted to be some assurances that it wouldn't cost them money if you're bringing in UConn until that next deal. So that seems like another kind of step that was maybe made in terms of this pitch. But yeah, I think it's just something where whether it's out there or not, it's always kind of been working in the background. And then, one of the things that I've heard recently that, I guess maybe wouldn't have played into this before was there's this sense that if the Big 12 would, kind of scoop up UConn, that could be like a stabilizing or a destabilizer for the ACC potentially. If Florida State and Clemson, if something happens with this whole grant of rights lawsuit and Florida State and Clemson find a way to get out and the ACC collapse, the idea that, well, the ACC might try to go to UConn as a piece to keep the remaining programs together. And if the Big 12 has UConn, that's kind of one less chess piece that the ACC could go to. And look, we saw this with the Pac-12, right? Brett Yormark is definitely thinking big picture in terms of what can I do to best position the Big 12, but also maybe, better position it against some of those other conferences that they're competing with. I don't know how much of that's going to factor into the decision of these Big 12 presidents in terms of what the ACC does and how UConn fits into that. But I do think that maybe that's kind of a more recent aspect of this deal that could have gotten brought up, that could have been part of what got everything moving again. And on UConn's side, the house settlement, right? Like,
yeah,
if you talk to anybody in college athletics right now, everyone is talking about the house settlement and the revenue sharing at the power conference level and where people are going to find the money for that. And so I'm sure on some level, UConn might have been looking and saying, as much as the Big 12 might be behind the Big 10 and the SEC in terms of revenue, it's also at another level because of football than the Big East is at. And everyone's trying to make sure that they have kind of their financials in order for this house settlement. So I think maybe those two things could have started to push this forward to the forefront a little bit than previously.
Well, we're going to dive in a little more when we come up after this. Ever hit that afternoon slump and just can't seem to get a push through? Trust me, I've been there. That's why I've reached for 5-Hour Energy. It's my go-to for tackling those endless to-do lists, doing a podcast in the middle of the day while you're doing other work. And whether I'm catching the big game or staying up late, it keeps me alert, in the zone. Plus, it has zero sugar. Flavors are watermelon and tropical burst are brand new. I haven't tried those, but I'm sure they're fantastic. There's something for everyone. Head over to their website where you can even customize your own 12 or 24 pack. Haven't done that. That sounds awesome. So what are you waiting for? Try 5-Hour Energy today. Do you know that the same things that fuel the best athletes also Sorry, let's try that again. Do you know the same things that fuel the best athletes in the world can still help the rest of us? Just ask Cam Spencer, who does every little thing he can to dial in his wellness, reduce inflammation in his body, and make sure he eats foods that fuel him. He does that with the help of Connecticut's best wellness brands, the Feel Good Lab. Here's what he has to say about it. I chose to partner with the Feel Good Lab because I wanted to elevate my performance, improve my health, and become more educated on my nutrition. Since we started working together, all of those goals have been reached. Now I'm continuing to find new ways to get better with the Feel Good team, and I'm very grateful for our partnership. For me, 3 years ago, I had a stroke that completely changed my life. It was a wake-up call. It pushed me to focus on my health and longevity like never before. Since then, I've been on a journey to not only recover, but to thrive, and be a big part of that journey has been finding the right resources to support my wellness goals. That is why I partnered with Ryan at the Feel Good Lab. They offer plant-based pain relief and recovery tools and the highest quality supplements. It's personalized, it's natural, it's making a real difference in my life every day. Plus, they're an official partner of UConn basketball. It's currently week 11 of my wellness journey with the Feel Good Lab, and so far I feel great. Use the code Cam Spencer to get 12% off your order and contribute 10% to Bleeding Blue for good. All right, we're back with Justin Williams of The Athletic, who broke this story with Andrew Marchand in contributing to the New York Times story. So I have one question. I think a lot of you started to touch on it about the ACC and some of the aspects of that in the last segment. Is this? I think UConn fans are really concerned about this. Is UConn being used as a leverage ploy to get ACC schools who maybe have one foot out the door? They're trying to figure out what they're up to and see if maybe they can get some more defections to create this super conference and essentially kill the ACC. I'm curious if that's been even talked about. You think that's even a possibility?
Yeah, I can't speak to that. That certainly might be the case. I do think, one of the things I would feel confident saying, I think anyone that pays attention to college sports is like, especially what we've seen the past few years, you got to best position yourself, whether that's you as an individual program, or if you're a conference commissioner like Brett Yormark, Greg Sankey, you want to best position your conference. And so I think you're seeing that on all of these fronts. You're seeing Brett Yormark wanting to best position, the Big 12 in this kind of power conference hierarchy. I think you're seeing UConn want to best position itself, like we said, with the House settlement, kind of all these changes happening to college sports. And then, yeah, if you're the ACC, I don't know exactly how UConn plays into their plans. I've heard some suggestions that like the ACC hasn't really engaged with UConn. That's not, something that I feel like totally locked down that I would, report out there. But again, these are, like we talked about, people are talking about different things. But I certainly think if you're the ACC, you're looking ahead and trying to, have some outlook in terms of if stuff does fall apart, if stuff does go sideways, what's the plan? And, the same way that the Pac-12 and Big 12, we were in the same position a year ago, it feels like. So I'm not totally sure whether UConn's being used as leverage on either side, but I think it's fair to say that the way college sports have gone recently, everyone has to kind of be trying to peek around the corners and planning for best case scenario, but oftentimes also maybe worst case scenario.
What do you say to people that are talking about this? Because it seems like the main drive to join the Big 12 is to bolster the football program, and I know that's not something that is going to happen with the Big 12 until 2031, which is wild to say. It's 7 years from now. It's just really, it's basically what it comes down to. We've talked to other folks about this. The implications are essentially TV rights, right? This all revolves around the money that you get from a revenue share model, and then also the House settlement. That's really what it comes down to, correct?
Yeah, I think so. You would know this much better than I do. It seems that UConn has no intentions of giving up, cutting ties with the football program. And I think if you're talking about the casual college sports fan, probably on the outside, that's what most of them probably are like. All right, well, they're great in basketball, men's and women's basketball. Why not just, stick in the Big East and leave
Trust
football
me.
behind?
Yep.
That clearly doesn't seem to be what UConn wants to do. But part of it, like you said, where is the money in all of this? In terms of TV revenue, it's football. And we can talk a lot about basketball. That's obviously a big revenue sport for a lot of programs. Brett Yormark's really interested in kind of the Big 12 being the basketball powerhouse and maybe splitting those deals. But it's clear football drives the money train in all of this. And so you have that aspect of it. And then you also have the House settlement, like you said, where I know there was some kind of sense that, hey, the Big East might be actually better positioned in kind of a house, future house settlement landscape because they don't have to worry about the football scholarships and all of that. True, but again, if you have SEC and Big 10 teams and Big 12 teams distributing that $20+ million a year, most of it might be going to football, but some of it's still going to go to basketball. Then you got to have these schools that aren't making nearly as much from their TV revenue in the Big East, kind of trying to figure out how to compete in that landscape. And so to me, I think that's what it comes down to is clearly in the, moving forward, football will continue to drive the revenue TV dollars. And then there's this, $20 million a year plus the scholarship changes that are kind of hanging out there with the house settlement. And I think a program like UConn, whether this works out in their favor or not, I think they're kind of looking at it and saying we might be a little bit, safer financially if we can kind of find a way to get into that football TV revenue marketplace.
He's Justin Williams. Just want to let you guys know college football is back. It's not too late to catch up before the season kicks off. SEC, ACC, Big 10, Big 12. You can get all that from Locked On, stable of college experts by subscribing to Locked On College Football Podcast. Who has a chance to make the playoff? What teams will cause chaos in their new conferences? Everything you need to know all in one place. Be sure to follow and subscribe to Locked On College Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Last question on this. ESPN has talked about that they might be willing to add more money to the Big 12's deal with UConn's inclusion, but Fox seems to be resistant to that. Could you elaborate on some of those differences in the stances that each of the companies have given right now? And is there a final decision on that? Do we have any numbers? Is it too early to talk about? I'm curious.
Yeah, I would say it's probably too early to talk numbers just because, this isn't finalized. So who knows what would happen there. But in terms of kind of the TV front with ESPN and Fox, like Fox has access to UConn basketball games right now, right? That's part of the Big East deal. So I think I understand their perspective being like, well, why would we want to give more money to the Big 12 for something we already are paying and have access to? ESPN, on the other hand, from what Andrew and I have reported, the sense is that while it would be budget neutral, meaning UConn wouldn't necessarily get a piece of the Big 12 revenue contract if they were to come over, ESPN would be willing to kick in, some extra money in order for the Big 12 to get UConn, and basically that money would go towards UConn. Now, I don't get the sense it would be equal to what UConn is getting, from the current Big East television deal. But then there's also this idea of, all right, well, UConn does pretty well in the NCAA tournament, and so there's going to be some units distributed from that. And the Big 12 also tends to get a lot of teams in the Big 12 in the NCAA tournament. So maybe there's something that we can make up the difference in NCAA tournament units, or some changes to conference tournament ticket sales and things like that. So I do think that there are these kind of other pieces that UConn is trying to figure out of, all right, if we want to make this jump for the long term, we also have to make sure we're not totally hurting ourselves kind of in the short term. And so I think that's part of kind of what is getting worked out on this deal for both sides. But yeah, just because it's still something that's kind of a work in progress, I think it's one of those things that, could maybe change if it gets one way, closer to a yes or no for either side.
He's Justin Williams from The Athletic. We'll have him for another 5 minutes or so, coming back after the break. Coming up after this. Come on. There we go. You've heard us talk about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. We'll have something a little different for you now through September 22nd. All FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket. That's a great deal. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every single season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account, a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Join with visiting FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook and go ahead and bet that $5. Get your free trial. This is my favorite one because we're starting this now. Hey, everyone, new baby's on the way, and I'm trying to minimize meal prep and still eat healthy and nutritious. That's why I love Factor. No prep, no mess meals. They're fresh, never frozen, and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Perfect for my busy schedule. I use the keto option, but there's Protein Plus, there's Calorie Smart. Factor has me covered, plus with 35 different meals and over 60 add-ons each week. I'm always exploring new flavors. Ready to kickstart your healthy routine? Head to factormeals.com/LockedOnCollege50. Use code LockedOnCollege50 for 50% off your first box. 20% off your next month. Trust me, you won't regret it. All right, we're back with Justin Williams of The Athletic for our last segment of the program. You mentioned this earlier in the show that Yormark has really positioned himself that he wants the Big 12 as the premier basketball conference. I've seen some wild stuff on Twitter lately about how he is literally trying to form almost like a super conference at some point, that it's not going to stop with adding UConn and others, that eventually it's maybe 24 schools and it's 12 on one side of the country and 12 on the other. Do you foresee that as kind of his vision, or has that been talked about, or is that just conjecture?
At least from what I've heard, that sounds like conjecture. I mean, I do think Yormark is a deal maker. He's someone that is kind of trying to think ahead and be forward thinking. We know in the past he was interested in Gonzaga as well, which, wouldn't even have the football component. But in terms of like specifics on a 24 team, super conference, I certainly haven't heard or, any specifics on that. But yeah, I do think that he views basketball, men's and women's, as kind of an undervalued asset when it comes to TV revenue. And I think the other part of this is, I think he understands like the Big 12's probably not catching the SEC and Big 10 in football, right? And but maybe if it can kind of further establish itself as like the preeminent power in basketball, that's just kind of another jewel in the Big 12's crown and something he can continue to work on. So yeah, in terms of like big brained mastermind schemes, I haven't heard anything specifically to that, but he's definitely, kind of hinted at and talked about wanting to split up the contracts in the next TV deal, where basketball is kind of off on its own, and maybe thinks that there's more value there than has previously been given to basketball in terms of contracts. And adding a program like UConn, that's, back-to-back champions in men's basketball, probably the most recognizable women's basketball brand, I think would only kind of fuel that ambition of his.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think it's interesting to me that at a time where women's sports is at its highest, that the women's basketball would be the first to kind of really be the beneficiary of this move, just based off of just playing in bigger arenas, having more exposure, because some of the Big East schools are lacking for the exposure and everything that goes with it. But last question for you before we let you go. Based on your sources, analysis, all of these discussions that are evolving in the next coming weeks, do you think we're likely to see UConn in the Big 12? Just merely your opinion. I won't hold you to it. Some of my fans or people that are on here may, but are they not imminent? But in your opinion, are they going to the Big 12, or is it kind of a hanging out in the Big East, wait and see what happens with the ACC? What are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, I think the fact that there hasn't been, internal support within the Big 12 previously to this point, and everything going on with the House settlement and kind of the uncertainty of what college sports might look like, I think it's going to be tough to get that super majority, the 12 of 16 Big 12 members, to kind of vote yes. Because, one of the other things I've heard from talking to sources within the membership is, UConn could be there in 2 or 3 or 4 years or whatever as a piece for the Big 12 to kind of go after. And so I think what seems most likely right now is that stuff, I don't know that there's going to be like a vote sometime in the immediate future for the Big 12 to, accept UConn to join. I think it's more likely that maybe we kind of continue to revisit this the same way we have, where it gets, brought up as Yormark's continuing to pursue, and maybe there's a change in college sports that brings it up again. But I think it would, not going to say it won't happen at all, but I think it's going to be a little bit of time, a year, a few years before something, would happen in terms of final decisions or movements.
That's so interesting to me that all of this is going on kind of real time, but and I know this is just your opinion, but you're in the know. Like, you've been following this story for a while. You wrote a great piece. That's why we wanted to have you on. So I find it so not ridiculous, but kind of just like crazy that it's out in the open, and then they're going to be like, well, we'll kind of wait and see. We'll see it. We'll see in 2025. We'll figure it out from there.
Yeah, I definitely think the fact that it's kind of gotten brought up and revived gives me the sense that maybe Brett Yormark or those in the Big 12 feel like there has at least been a little bit of movement, or they can maybe get closer to yes than they have been before. But I think it's just, the other thing you keep hearing when you talk, again, whether it's Big 12 or otherwise, everyone is so focused on this House settlement and what that's going to mean moving forward. And so I think there's a hesitancy of like to take on a new thing to add on top of whatever else they're dealing with. But as I realized a long time ago, predicting things in college sports is kind of ridiculous and folly. So I'm not going to totally put my neck out there on this one either.
Well, Justin, you tell me about it from last Tuesday to today. It's been my Twitter mentions have been fun. Let's just put it that way. Listen, you've been great. I really appreciate you coming on. But before I let you go, just letting everyone know that Locked On College Football is back. You can check out the Locked On College Football podcast with Spencer McLaughlin. He gets you ready for an exciting season on the gridiron. Locked On College Football, part of the Locked On College Football podcast, your team every day. This has been another episode of Locked On UConn. I'm your host, Mark Zanetto, for Justin Williams of The Athletic. We ask you to stay locked in, stay connected, make sure your toughness meter is always rising. And as always, go Huskies.